Okay, I think we're ready to start. Thank you everyone for coming. Welcome to today's discussion on with National Security and Counterterrorism expert Mark Fallon, organized by the Oxford Blavatnik School of Government's Insitute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, also known as ELEC. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Federica and I'm the Executive Director of ELEC's Program on International Peace and Security. Both ELEC as an institute and the program have been at the school for a little over a year. I was going to say, if you're one of our MPP students, you'll learn more about our work tomorrow at the school's fair, but for those of you who are not going to be in tomorrow at our school fair, we're an interdisciplinary research institute that draws from the disciplines of law, international relations, and philosophy to strengthen the laws, norms, and institutions that restrain, regulate, and prevent armed conflict. As part of our mission to strengthen the rule of law, promote global governance, and counter forms of violence that go beyond or perhaps do not reach the threshold of armed conflict, we've also set up a program on international peace and security, which brings together experts and researchers working in the fields of foreign policy, including around issues of leadership and global governance, as well as defense and security studies. I'm pleased that a number of our research fellows are here. I would like to acknowledge in particular Federica de Sousa Diaz, who has been very instrumental in the organization of this work, as well as Lindsay Robinson, our research projects manager, who directed you to come here. Today's discussion is part of a National Security in Perspective talk series hosted by our program, the first of which was given last year by U.S. Attorney Alka Pradhan and U.S. Air Force Captain Mark Andrew, who are both serving as the DoD, that is Department of Defense, appointed lawyers for one of the suspected plotters of the 9/11 attacks, Ammar al-Baluchi, who is still held today at the United States military prison located within Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, and he's awaiting trial before the U.S. military commissions. The video for that talk, for those who might be interested, can be accessed on our website, and you can also subscribe to our newsletter there to stay abreast of our other activities. Now, it is a great privilege for me to introduce you to today's speaker, Mark Fallon. Mark brings to the fore over 30 years of service in national security and counterterrorism, including as a senior executive with the Department of Homeland Security, as a deputy U.S. Marshal, and as a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Most saliently for today's discussion, in 2002, Mark was appointed deputy commander of the Criminal Investigative Task Force, or CITIF, as its acronym I believe is pronounced, that was created by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and put under the responsibility of the Secretary of the Army, even though it was composed by members of 4 out of 5 branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, including the Navy, to collect criminal evidence against suspected terrorists in the aftermath of 9/11 and bring them to justice. And bringing terrorists to justice was not something new to Mark, since he had investigated some of the most consequential and significant terrorist attacks in U.S. history, including the first bombing of the World Trade Center, as well as the attack on the USS Cole while she was being refueled in Yemen's Aden harbor. However, as you will hear today, as soon as Camp X was reopened and as soon as detainees started to arrive at Guantanamo, Mark understood immediately that this was going to be a mission like no other. In his role as deputy commander for the CITIF, Mark observed firsthand the gradual, deliberate, and profoundly consequential impact of the choice to torture detainees both at Guantanamo and in other U.S. military prison camps pertaining to Operation Enduring Freedom and the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, such as Abu Ghraib and Bagram in Afghanistan. I met Mark a few years ago at the U.S. Army Military Academy at West Point. At the time, I was working with Alberto Mora, who had been President Bush General Counsel of the Navy, to whom Mark reported the abuse he witnessed while serving with CITIF. When I met Mark, Alberto Mora had already left government, and we were both part of a research team at Harvard trying to understand and qualify the costs and consequences of the U.S. use of torture and extraordinary renditions in its response to 9/11 and the so-called war on terror. Even though the consequences of that choice have to yet be fully understood, there is no doubt that they have been profound. There is no doubt, for example, that this choice had a detrimental impact on the U.S. respect for and abidance to the rule of law domestically, as the choice to hold prisoners at Guantanamo and other detention and other sites of extraordinary rendition were conceived specifically with the intent to create gray areas for the application of U.S. domestic law and thus shield detainees from the protection that the law might have otherwise awarded them. As our research at Harvard, West Point, and elsewhere has highlighted, this choice also had devastating consequences on America's diplomacy and ability to project both soft and military power, not only in terms of its leadership and standing in the world, which in turn impacted its ability to achieve foreign policy objectives, but also in terms of its relationship with its closest allies, and our joint approach to defense and national security, which had consequences for U.S. and joint military operations in and beyond Iraq, Afghanistan, both at the tactical and strategic level. To those who, like Mark, like Alberto, like many other American patriots, worked to understand and expose the cost of the torture program, learning that these lessons have failed to be assimilated by the U.S. government at its highest level, must be a disturbing reality. Hearing the current president of the United States actually openly advocate for torturing terrorists and sending them to Guantanamo must indeed be like looking back at those first early years in the Bush administration through the looking glass. Of course, today we won't have time to delve into each of these consequences or consequential dimensions, I should say, of the torture program, though we will certainly get to talk about the fact that the Syria-inspired enhanced interrogation techniques, as they were called, were at a minimum counterproductive. Not only they didn't yield actionable intelligence, they also prevented the United States government from bringing any of the alleged terrorists held at Guantanamo to trial. Put simply, thanks to Mark's perspective and first-hand testimony as a seasoned national security and counterterrorism expert, today we will discuss exactly why torture and other inhumane treatments are and have always been, as he puts it in his book, Unjustifiable Means. And now, before we turn to Mark, we would like to show you a short clip.
Conduct ourselves under the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. And that Common Article 3 says that there will be no outrages upon human dignity. It's very vague. What does that mean?
They used the CIA paradigm of sensory deprivation and self-inflicted pain, and then they stretched it, okay? They added to it. They probed Arab cultural sensitivities, okay? And they discovered that nudity and fear of dogs.
The American Psychological Association is the world's largest organization of psychologists and probably has the most influence over the community of psychologists around the world.
Secretly, the APA permitted psychologists working in the torture program to override their ethical code of do no harm if the military and CIA required it.
The program of abusive interrogations, the program of torture at the CIA was designed by psychologists, and at Guantanamo was designed by a psychologist and a psychiatrist after they were trained in the techniques and in the program of the CIA abuses. And that's when I could basically stand it no more. And so suddenly I went from just being a psychologist in my office to becoming the face of opposition to the APA's position.
The role of psychologists in this torture program astounds me. I saw that we're heading down a road that I knew was going to be a disaster. And so I was taking those torture logs and other information, and I was sending them through classified channels. I wasn't a whistleblower. I wouldn't talk to the media, and I wouldn't disclose classified information. I was sending this information through my chain of command to say, the Department of Defense is about to torture people.
In 2002, Mark put his neck on the line and warned his superiors that the CIA were using torture.
I felt like there was an avalanche. You can see these boulders coming down and you can wave your arms and you can try to stop it. But I could not stop what was happening. The bloodthirst to torture people was just too great for any one person to stop.
Your interrogation rules of engagement go far beyond the Geneva Convention. Stress positions, sleep management, dietary manipulation. All of these things go far beyond a standard which says there'll be no physical or mental torture nor any other form of coercion. That's the Geneva Convention. These rules of engagement for interrogation issued by your department are inconsistent with those.
Guantanamo has become the calling cry. Torture is some sign of American power that allows people to think that America will be great again. The United States right now is one terrorist attack away from reinstituting torture.
Since the 1950s, we know these techniques have been used in Afghanistan, Argentina, Australia, Borneo, Brazil, British Guyana, British Cameroon, Canada, Chile, Cuba, Great Britain, Guatemala, Honduras, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Lithuania, Morocco, Northern Ireland, Pakistan, the Philippines, Poland, Romania, Thailand, Turkey, Uruguay, Vietnam, and Yemen.
What do you think about waterboarding? I said, I like it a lot, and I don't think it's tough enough.
So, Mark, first of all, thank you for being with us today. Thank you for joining us. And very briefly, to contextualize, what are the EITs and how did they come about?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for hosting me here, and it's a pleasure to see all of you here today. The EIT program was coined that phrase by the CIA. They called it the Enhanced Interrogation Techniques, but that's just a manipulation of language. The EIT program was nothing more than an excuse to inflict torture. And the process is actually based on, you saw a clip from a documentary film called Eminent Monsters, a manual for modern torture. And what the film depicts is the truth, that this program that the CIA embarked upon after 9/11 wasn't new at all. It was just a reconstitution of a program that had been first established in the 50s with research funded by both the United States CIA and the United Kingdom, where they actually looked at sensory deprivation in Canada by a doctor named Cameron to try to see what the effects of sensory deprivation and other things would do to the human person. That evolved into what was called the MK Ultra program, it was called, and the CIA started a manual called the Kubark Counterintelligence Manual, which actually laid out how to actually utilize these type of techniques that eventually were used with the hooded men, with the techniques used over here with the troubles in Northern Ireland, and evolved to Guantanamo Bay and on to Abu Ghraib. But these were not new techniques. These were actually techniques that the communists had used for years. The Soviets had used them, the North Koreans had used them, and what the science had shown, the analysis had shown over the years, was that if you isolate people, if you sensory deprive them, if you create the conditions which are called debility, dependency, and dread, if you make someone's existence so dreadful, they will become more pliable and they will tell you information that you want to hear. And so that's what the program was actually based on, and we decided to weaponize it after 9/11 and and reinstitute a program that we found over the years gave us false and fabricated information and wasn't useful, but in a zest for revenge and with decisions that were based on fear, ignorance, and frankly arrogance, we went down a pathway that we're going to pay for generations to come.
Thank you. I have an email here that I would like to read, and we have it onto the screen for the audience to see as well. For those in the back, please come have a seat. There is space in the front. That didn't work. All right. So your email reads, we need to ensure seniors at OGC are aware of the 170 strategies and how it might impact CITIF and commissions. This looks like the kind of stuff congressional hearings are made of. Comments like it is basically subject to perception. If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong, and any of the techniques that lie on the harshest end of the spectrum must be performed by a highly trained individual seems to stretch beyond the bounds of legal propriety. Talk of wet towel treatment would, in my opinion, shock the conscience of any legal body looking at using the results of the interrogations or possibly even the interrogators. Someone needs to be considering how history will look back at this. What prompted you to write this email?
Yeah, this was a transition point for me. The summer of 2002, we had identified a guy named Mohammed al-Qahtani at Guantanamo, who was destined to be the 20th hijacker for the 9/11 attacks. There were only 19 hijackers that actually flew the flights, and most likely Qahtani would have been the remaining hijacker on the one plane that didn't reach its intended target. He would have been a muscle hijacker. He was turned away at Orlando Airport and sent back home. But when we identified Qahtani as likely the 20th hijacker, he became, to us, a high-value target for prosecution before military commissions, a new process that we had not done before and that I was responsible for conducting the investigations for. And as we were going down that road, there was a lot of competition for who got to talk to Qahtani. And the military intelligence apparatus wanted to talk with him and utilize what the CIA was calling enhanced interrogation techniques. But what it was the utilization of programs that we use in our survival training: survive, evade, resist, and escape. And what we use those techniques to do is try to sensitize our service members of the types of brutality that they might experience if they were captured by an adversary that doesn't comport with the Geneva Conventions. And so they are humiliated, and they're treated to a few days of controlled torture, for lack of a better term. But the goal is to try to sensitize them and let them know what they might expect from a brutal adversary. Well, we weaponize that and use that. And on October 2nd, a lawyer from the CIA, from the Counterintelligence Center, came to Guantanamo Bay and actually described what I did not know at the time was a highly compartmented and classified program. One of the deepest secrets in the U.S. government was actually the details of how they were going to administer this type of particularly psychological torture. Because what the research has shown is that psychological torture is actually more devastating than physical torture on the human being. And so when I saw this occur on October 2nd, I had someone who was in that meeting who took copious notes about what questions were asked, what questions were answered, because my goal was to try to prevent a crime from occurring. I believed, while I had no control over the CIA, I was the senior criminal investigator, senior federal agent responsible for investigating the Al-Qaeda terrorist network for trials before military commission. And the CIA had come on my base, a Navy base, at Guantanamo Bay, and I felt that a conspiracy to torture was about to be committed by the Department of Defense. And while that occurred on the 2nd of October, I didn't commit that to the document that you read until later that month, because that was the day I met General Jeffrey Miller. And General Jeffrey Miller was a new general being brought down to Guantanamo to actually implement this new torture procedures within the Department of Defense. And I met him on that day as a new general with no experience in intelligence, no experience in interrogations, no experience with Al-Qaeda, and no experience in the Middle East. He was an artillery officer, but he was brought in to execute Donald Rumsfeld's policies to torture prisoners. And when I first met him, he came to my office, and I thought I was going to convince him how this process was wrong. And I soon learned that he was there to implement this torture program. And it wasn't hours before he left my office when I got a call from the G2 of the Army, the senior civilian intelligence officer of the Army, to tell me that the lawyers had approved sending to the Secretary of Defense these same techniques and recommended approval. And so at that point, I saw that the lawyers were not going to save us. In my mind, in my career in NCIS, what I had always found was that an operational commander, a Marine Corps general, a Navy admiral, they might want to go down a pathway, and if I couldn't convince them it was an error, generally the lawyers would. The lawyers would be the ones to convince them that what they're doing is unlawful and would have severe consequences. In this case, that didn't happen. And when I saw that that document was going to be forwarded up from Guantanamo through the chain of command to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I felt that I better document my position, and I better send that around and circulate it so that there's some type of documentary record of what was happening, because I believe that we were about to commit war crimes.
So you just described the EIT program as one of the most secretive and highly classified programs in the U.S. government at the time. How is it that I was holding, or I am holding here in my hand, and we have it on screen, a documentation of this? How did it come about to be in the public record?
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't know about the program at the time that I saw that. I just thought this was hapless, possibly well-attended, but uninformed or misinformed people who thought they were trying to do some good. I never, in my wildest imagination, ever thought that this was actually sanctioned by seniors. I never, at the time, I had no idea that George Bush had issued a memorandum of notification on the 17th of September 2001 that authorized the CIA to create what was called the RDI program, Rendition, Detention, Interrogation Program, none of which were core competencies of the CIA, none of which were things that they really knew how to do. And so when I saw what was occurring at Guantanamo, I just thought these were low-level people who didn't know what they were doing. So I was trying to document this and send it to seniors to say, you don't understand what's going on here. While we in the Department of Defense don't control the CIA, they may be doing something that they may be authorized to do or not. But in the Department of Defense, we have a different standard. We have the Uniform Code of Military Justice. We have a code of conduct. We believe in these things. We believe in these codes. People die for these things. We have a constitution that we have to protect. And so when I sent that, had I been read into the program, I would not have been able to send that document. And even the fact that you hold it in your hands here is amazing. That actual document, I was denied access to my own emails after I sounded the alarm. That document came from the ACLU. They FOIA'd information, and when I had to talk to Senator Levin, the Senate Armed Service Committee, when they were investigating detainee abuse, I was denied access to these same records. But fortunately, through the ACLU and others, they had FOIA'd these records and had obtained them and provided them. And I actually, somebody found these documents and sent them to me through a FOIA lawsuit. But I was denied access to my own records from the government when I was trying to talk to investigators for the government about what we had done.
And FOIA is, of course, Freedom of Information Act. I have a note that on August 27 of 2003, you also corresponded with Peter Zolper, who I understand was at the time the staff judge advocate for the CITIF, and which is the task force that you were running. Why did you re-forward this correspondence to him at that time? What happened around then?
Yeah, there was another significant date, certainly in my history, and I think in the global war on terrorism history. This same General Miller, who was sent to Guantanamo to institute the SEER program, this torture program within Guantanamo, was being sent by Donald Rumsfeld to Abu Ghraib to gitmoize the Iraq theater, to institute these same procedures, these same torture techniques, taking the same program that the CIA was using, who called it EIT. In the Department of Defense, it was the same process, but they called it counter-resistance techniques, counter-resistance strategies. And General Miller was going over there to gitmoize the Iraq theater. And at the time, even though President Bush had said that the Geneva Conventions did not apply in Afghanistan, they did apply in Iraq. They did apply in Iraq. And so I was trying to stop General Miller from going into Afghanistan. I was trying to convince seniors in the Pentagon that that was the wrong road to take, that they were getting false and fabricated information. I knew at the time that the CIA program was producing false and fabricated information. We were chasing wild goose chases. Bad information was coming out. And when I saw that General Miller was heading there, I tried to send someone alongside of him to convince others that his way was not right, but that person was not allowed to go to meetings. And so what we decided to do was, even though we had electronic copies of our records, we felt that we needed a hard copy. So we were afraid, because these were war crimes, that the elements within the government who were committing these things would come in and try to deny us access to those records. So we had them printed out, and we created binders so that there would be some type of documentary evidence of the crimes that we were about to commit.
So it is, in your opinion, it is accurate to say that what was going on at Guantanamo migrated to other detention facilities in the context of those two other military operations the U.S. was running?
Yeah, actually, General Miller brought with him people from Guantanamo. They brought with them dog leashes. He instituted a program. He had told the people over in Iraq that you need to treat these people worse than dogs. They shouldn't be allowed to walk on the sidewalk or pavement. They should walk alongside. And so he gitmoized. He brought these same practices to that theater, and then he was eventually sent to that theater to be in charge of all interrogations in the Iraq theater, and that's when Abu Ghraib had happened and really blew the whole program wide open.
Thank you, and maybe I don't want to take too much time with my questions, because I'm sure there's plenty of questions from the audience, and I hope that someone will ask about investigations that happened later, because I think that's interesting too, to see how the government was trying to put a cap back on, using the very same people that were overseeing the program to investigate it. So in any case, let's let aside for a moment the moral and legal questions surrounding what was happening. Why did you, obviously you pointed to the fact that there was a sense of urgency, a will to get revenge, and a lot of fear, a lot of misinformation. And these are, I think, emotions that as humans we can all maybe sympathize and relate to. But there's something to be said about why you, as a professional, never bought into this idea. Why is it that the narrative that extraordinary times demanded extraordinary measures didn't pick up with you as it did with others?
I think extraordinary times require extraordinary courage. And so what we and our task force looked at was the fact that we pledge allegiance to the Constitution, right? Al-Qaeda pledges bayat to a leader, pledges bayat to bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current head of Al-Qaeda. We in the United States, we swear allegiance to the Constitution, protect and defend that Constitution from all enemies, foreign or domestic. And so I had gone through my career knowing that, and so when I was told that Donald Rumsfeld has authorized this, as Donald Rumsfeld doesn't make law, and our allegiance is not to a particular person, but it's to the ideals that our country was founded upon. And so I just found that it was my job, that it was my duty, that I had an obligation as a professional to, one, stand up against things that I thought were unlawful, but having worked, particularly Al-Qaeda since the 90s with the Blind Sheikh, Omar al-Darrahman case, as the commander of the USS Cole Task Force investigating the attack on the USS Cole with the FBI, what we found was, and what we knew through the body of work that represented my career, was what we call rapport-based techniques were the most effective ways to obtain accurate, reliable information. And what people don't realize is while the CIA hired 2 psychologists who had no experience in Al-Qaeda, no experience in the Middle East, no experience in interrogation, and paid them, well, they were paid over $80 million, but the actual contract was for $183 million. After Abu Ghraib, they shut the contract down. Actually, full-time operational psychologists from the intelligence community, including the CIA, were helping me develop rapport-based interrogation tactics because he knew them to be the effective ones. And so interrogation professionals knew what to do. Who didn't know what to do was the CIA, and who didn't know what to do was these psychiatrists who they brought in to do this.
But so, I mean, how is it possible? Obviously, the U.S. government hired you because of that professional expertise to investigate Al-Qaeda and sent you to Guantanamo. How is it possible that they would discount the advice of the very professionals that they hired?
That's a great question, Federica. And so, but in this program, nobody was ever supposed to know about. I mean, this program was supposed to be so secretive that other people in the CIA would never know about it. Other people in the U.S. government would never know about it. These people would be whisked away off the streets of wherever they were at, taken to these black sites, without due regard for what the end game was. And that's what I asked when I saw what was happening with the RDI program. What's your end game here? What's your goal? Okay, when you're done with them, what do you do? Do you keep them in indefinite detention? I mean, is the CIA prepared to be jailers until someone dies? Will you turn them over to another country to possibly be killed? Will you kill them yourselves? I mean, have you thought through what is, after you torture someone, what do you then do with the body? And so what I don't think they did was really think this through. They gave this mission to people who it should have never gone to, who lacked any type of experience in this arena, and they just were winging it. They were guessing, and they were just trying to do what they may have thought was right or best, but what we found out is how terribly wrong it went.
Tell me something else before we turned to the audience. You talked about the resistance that you encountered in trying to report this up the chain of command, but you also did find some allies in this attempt to kind of, well, stop it first and then find some accountability for what had happened. So one question there is, which allies did you find, if any? And the second question is, what happened after you said, so after Abu Ghraib, the whole program kind of blew up. What was the U.S. government response then? Was there an investigation whatsoever? What type of accountabilities, quote unquote, did they try to find?
Sure. So The first part of your question, which was?
Allies. Did you
Oh,
find
yeah,
any
yeah,
allies
yes.
in your
So-
attempt to bring this
So
up?
when I saw what was happening and I was trying to document it and go up my chains of command, I was detailed, as you said, to the Army. And so I went up my Army chain of command, and while everyone within the Army chain agreed with me, no one was willing to do anything about it. They felt that we had lodged our objections, so we were covered because I objected, and it's on record that I objected. And I went back up to my, because I reported to Donald Rumsfeld's office operationally for this task force, went through that chain of command, and of course, the people that I reported to, the lawyers I reported to in the Office of General Counsel said, we understand your objections, we don't disagree with you, but the boss says we can do this. And they were unwilling to take any steps against their boss, the lawyers there. And my last resort was back up my parent command, NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and I went back up to the director of NCIS, who felt that we had an obligation to try to do something to stop it. So he went through his reporting chain to the Secretary of the Navy, which is through Alberto Mora, who is the General Counsel of the Navy, a appointee by President Bush. And when I explained to Alberto what was happening, he, like me, first thought it was a mistake. It's not conceivable. It's not possible that any lawyer would have sanctioned what was happening there. His assessment was it was just flawed legal analysis by some junior person, and thank you, Mark, appreciate you bringing it to my attention, I'm going to stop this. And he went down to the Army General Counsel's office thinking this was going to be a big mistake, and found that he looked at the records and saw that this was actually approved by Donald Rumsfeld, and went to John Yoo, who infamously wrote the torture memos, and could not believe what he heard. He believed this was a flawed law, he believed it was flawed policy, and he believed that the Bush presidency was actually at stake. He actually told me that. He said, I just could not believe it. So we went about, at least, we didn't stop it, but we certainly slowed it down, and we curtailed the worst abuses within the Department of Defense. We ensured that, they didn't waterboard, although there was other uses of water, but the waterboarding under the official sanctioning the way the CIA did it was not conducted within the Department of Defense, to my knowledge. But what I found was that the military lawyers all stood up. The senior military lawyers of the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Army all opposed these techniques. That opposition was overridden by the political appointees. And so that's the concern and trouble today that you see when you have a commander-in-chief, a president of the United States, a Donald Trump, who says what you heard him say on videotape there about waterboarding, who seems to have a bloodthirst for torture, in my view, who seems to relish brutality, that there might be opposition along the way, but who's going to stand up? Who's going to take a stand? Where are the Alberto Moras today? Where are the people who are going to say, not on my watch, we're not going to do this? So that's a concern, because the investigations, the second part of your question, over the years there have been many whitewashes. Within the Department of Defense, they conducted these investigations to try to cover the torture, and it really wasn't until the Senate Armed Service Committee report came out, when Senator Carl Levin was the chair of that, that the first aspects of the DOD involvement of the program were revealed. And then in 2014, when the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence, the SISI, torture report executive summary came out, it was revealed really the fallacy of the CIA program. And there's a few movies I recommend to you. Eminent Monsters, which you saw the clip from, A Manual for Modern Torture. I'll be speaking after a screening of that Friday at Goldsmiths in London. The movie The Report is about Dan Jones' effort and Dianne Feinstein's effort to actually release the torture report executive summary. And that executive summary that details what happened is 550 pages, a little less than that. The actual report and summary is 6,000 pages, the whole report. And so there has been a concerted effort within the government to classify, hide, and redact our national policy of state-sponsored torture. My book, there were 113 redactions in it. It went to 10 agencies before it could be released, and it was delayed 8 months. I currently, my law firm, the ACLU, and the Knight First Amendment Institute represent me. We have a lawsuit against Gina Haspel, the director of the CIA, the director of the Office of National Intelligence, the director of NSA, and the Secretary of Defense about this pre-publication review process. I cannot write anything, publicize it, even though I've been retired from the government for over a decade, without submitting it to the government first, for them to review and circulate around, see if anybody opposes my position and claim that what I was writing is classified. So we are still fighting that battle to get the truth out, because truth matters. And we're convinced that if the public knew what I know, if the public knew what Senator Feinstein knows, what Dan Jones knows, or what other people who know the details of this program, you would be horrified of the atrocities that we committed in the name of the American people.
I mean, they can know, because actually none of what you included in the book was classified information. So I was going to say there is a place for this type of review, but not when it is used to silence. And by the way, each one of you on your chairs should have a little couple of leaflets, one of which is of Mark's book, which I really highly recommend. My last question, and then we'll turn to the audience. What prompts a person like you, who has served his whole life as government and has done it from quote unquote the shadows? You've never had a very public profile. And this was a watershed moment for you. After this, you decided to go public, and you've been involved in a number of initiatives, actually, of advocacy, actually, to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Why did you do it, and what are these initiatives you're involved with?
Yeah, I know one journalist called me the Forrest Gump of terrorism, because I seem to be always around these terrorist events when they occurred. And it's a similar position that I found myself working with human rights organizations and working with filmmakers and others. And the reason really was a group called Human Rights First in the United States had heard some of the things I was saying privately and came to me and basically said, we need your voice. We don't have enough people who are outside of our human rights bubble speaking out. And you have a very unique position in history, being involved in these events, and we need your voice to kind of tell people what you can about what happened. And so I first kind of teamed with them to try to ensure that the torture report was released. And I lobbied and did briefings on Capitol Hill and met with senators, with Alberto Mora and General Taguba, to get the McCain-Feinstein Anti-Torture Act passed, and to try to get President Obama to sign the NDAA that kind of better codified that the U.S. will not torture in the future, at least to the best of his extent in that NDAA. And so I found myself in a position where I believe I'm just still doing my duty. I mean, you know, as Roosevelt said in his famous talk in France, he talked about citizens of the republic, and it talks about it's not the critic who counts is the famous phrase in that everyone remembers. But he also talks about later in it about the responsibilities of citizens in a republic and what our responsibility is to that republic. And so at my more mature age now, this is my attempt to ensure that we learn some lessons from the past. And so I'm very involved with the other book that I'll, for lack of a better term, put a shameless plug in, is Interrogation and Torture, which we're going to launch in Geneva next week. This is a book that tries to give the next me, the next Alberto Mora, some type of documentation to support their position. And so we brought together 36 contributing authors from 14 countries to talk about interrogation and torture from an efficacy perspective, from a legal perspective, and from a moral perspective. Efficacy, legality, and morality. And we will, on International Human Rights Day next week in Geneva, with a keynote given by Nils Melzer, the current UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, we will launch this book. And there's other efforts as well that I'm involved in. I'm on a 15-person global steering committee. I was asked to serve on that by Juan Mendez, the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. I helped Juan. I was brought in when he did his thematic for the United Nations in 2016 about the need for a protocol on non-coercive interviewing. And in 2017, I testified at a side event at the UN General Assembly about the very need for this process. But we are now in the process of synthesizing a universal protocol on non-coercive interviewing and all of the practices that we will be recommending for hopeful resolution before the United Nations and for countries to adopt are processes that are lawful, human rights compliant, and have a foundation in science, that they would be effective, so that we can negate the argument that we shouldn't have to have whether torture is effective, right? We shouldn't have to argue whether it's effective or not because a prohibition is absolute. However, there is a segment that you're going to have to make that argument to. So we can show conclusively by science, we can show by what has occurred with over 100 people the CIA has tortured that we know about how ineffective, how unreliable, how false information is a product of that. And so we're hoping now that we have the public's ear with movies like The Report out, Eminent Monsters, Taxi to the Dark Side, a movie will be coming out next year, Prisoner 760, about Mohamedou Slahi, who I write about in my book and who wrote the book Guantanamo Diaries. So we're hoping that with public awareness, it will shock the conscience and that we will be able to ensure that we never, ever go down this road again.
Thank you. Let's see if we have questions. I've got 4 already. Okay, the first one right here. Please use the mic.
Thank you for your presentation, sir. Do you take the view that it is unethical and unconstitutional for the British and American governments to behave as they did in the lead up to 2003 when they deliberately exaggerated the strength of the evidence for the development of nuclear, chemical and biological weapons in Iraq? I'd be interested to hear of your response also, if you would, to Scott Ritter's claim in relation to Operation Rockingham.
I'm not sure what that last part is.
Should I explain?
Yes, in 2 words.
So Scott Ritter claimed, I believe in 2002 or 2003, that there wasn't a program called Operation Rockingham, or which was engaged in by the British and the Americans to deliberately plant misinformation on the ground in Iraq that could be reported to indicate non-compliance with weapons inspections by the Iraqis to facilitate invasion.
So the question really is, was the intelligence and weapons of mass destruction cooked up, and what's your stand on it? But don't answer it just yet, because we're going to take 2 more questions. There was one on this side. Yes.
Thank you for your courage. It's very, very encouraging for us professors. And I have a very general question: is what could be your advices for students, our students, to become whistleblowers? Because you had to face a really huge moral dilemma, and your advices, could be extremely interesting.
Thank you. Very good question. We'll take one more here at the back.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. And I must take my hat off to you and really bow to you, because you've actually taken a very high moral position. However, on a pragmatic and practicable stance, We have gone from 1970s, the time of Nixon, to time of Trump. Nixon, in comparison, is a pillar of respectability and integrity. There is not much hope, if you have a look, that your position will prevail for a very long time because of the human nature and because of the politicians that we have and the politicians that somehow come to the top, especially in the United States. My question to you,
please keep it brief.
My question to you is what Alan Dershowitz has actually proposed. Essentially, maybe legalize or regulate torture. Because what Alan says, and I'm no fan of Dershowitz, can you?
Well,
No, I think I'm trying to make a point. You've taken a long time to actually question, if I may, and I will be very brief.
I also am the host
Alan
of today's event.
Dershowitz says, I am not in favor of torture, but if you are going to have it, it should be well regulated or have court approval. I'm
Sir,
just asking your...
We got the point. Can we regulate torture? Thank you.
Okay.
Mark, go ahead.
So the first question is, I can't speak about weapons of mass destruction piece of it because I don't know. I'll tell you what I do know, however, that we used the derivative product of torture to go to war in Iraq. And so we had an emir of an al-Qaeda training camp, the Khaldun camp, named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, in custody in Bagram, in Afghanistan. And he was someone that I thought would be a high-value target to bring to justice for military commission process. Before I had the ability to do so, he was taken away. He was rendered to another country, which is revealed in the Sisi torture report. Most people would say it was Egypt. And he was tortured. And what al-Libi said was that there were high-level al-Qaeda connections in Iraq. And that piece of intelligence, that bit of intelligence to support a policy decision was used by President Bush when he went to Ohio to rally up the American public to support a war in Iraq. And then Colin Powell, before the United Nations, used that same information to try to drive us to war and get a coalition together. And we did. He went to war in Iraq. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi said when he was debriefed after that is, I just made that up so the pain would stop. And so we went to war based on false and fabricated information that was the derivative product of torture. So oftentimes when people ask me, does torture work? Sure, it works. It's very effective to support a policy decision. It's not very effective to get truthful and accurate, reliable information. And I had mentioned earlier, I posed that question. Actually, I posed that same question in Langley to the CIA. What's your end game? What are you going to do? Ibn Sheikh al-Libi never got to my custody, never got to Guantanamo, never went on trial. The U.S. government turned him over to the Libyan government. And just when the ICRC was going to talk to him, it was reported that he committed suicide in his cell in a Libyan prison. So we never got to hear again from Ibn Sheikh al-Libi. And so that's the problem, to get back to your Alan Dershowitz question. Why would you legally sanction a process that would give you false information? So it's a foolish argument made by a lawyer who doesn't know what he's talking about, Alan Dershowitz. And we actually address that in a chapter in this book about the fallacy of that. And that's what I always get, the ticking time bomb scenario, right? If the chips are down, somebody has to do something. Why would you want bad information faster? I mean, I just don't understand that. With Abu Zubaydah, when they started the EIT program on him, they put him in isolation for 47 days. If you're worried about the bomb, would you put someone in isolation for 47 days without asking them any questions? I mean, it's a foolish argument that people make all the time to try to justify torture. But if you really look at it, there's really no utility in it. And the other
question about the obstacles that you had to face and the moral dilemma really you had to face as someone reporting and blew in the whistle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes leadership at all levels. And I know when we established our task force, we established a training program for all of our personnel. And we anticipated that people would be furious. We anticipated that when someone got in a room with one of these terrorists, that their instincts are going to want to take revenge. And so we addressed it. We talked about Nuremberg. We talked about how you must not follow an unlawful order. And we did an orientation program, and I told everyone who worked for me, you must not follow an unlawful order, even if it comes from me. You're duty bound to challenge me. You're duty bound not to follow that order. And so when we looked at our personnel, I never wanted to put people who I led in a position that they would regret later. How could you, as a leader, allow someone to torture another human being? I mean, look at the devastating consequences of that. I know people who have tortured. I know how tortured they are today. Eric Fair, an interrogator I know, wrote a book called Consequence, about the consequence of his actions, about his torture at Abu Ghraib. It stays with you. Once you've crossed that line, you carry that with you forever. So as a leader, how could you put someone else in that position? Because as a leader, I always made decisions: what is fair to the organization, what is fair to myself, and what is fair to that individual in the order that I'm giving. And so what I would encourage you as professors and your students to do is go with your heart, because you're going to have to live with your decisions.
Thank you. And there was a question right here.
Thank you. It seems like throughout your experience, you continue to face obstacles within the administration, and you continue to face that, having to put everything through each government department. How do you feel about the role of organisations like WikiLeaks, and particularly individuals like Chelsea Manning? And do you think, in large, that they've helped or hindered bringing issues like this to light?
Well, as far as helping bring issues to light, they certainly have. But I'm not in favor of that. I mean, I utilized the chain of command. I mean, I felt it would be unlawful for me to disclose classified information. And there's things I know today I can't talk about. I still have a security clearance. So I don't believe that is, for me, a route that I'm willing to take. Now, did it disclose things? Absolutely. It brought things to light, and I think we are better in society for it. But the potential damage that can be done, the potential damage that might have been done, we're just not sure of. And so the challenge we have now, and you see it right now going on in our Congress with whistleblowers coming out against President Trump, we need to institute processes to protect these people when they come forward. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned I have a suit against the government about the pre-publication review process, because my feeling is that if you don't give someone an avenue to speak out, they will go around and disclose possible classified information. So while I wouldn't, and I lived with the 113 redactions in my book, someone else might not. And so the best method to protect your highly classified information is to ensure that when somebody comes forward, you act upon it, so that you don't result in some possibly inadvertent disclosures of things that might cost lives.
All right, let's see if there are questions right here. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that probably at that time CIA didn't think through that what would they do after achieving their objectives, or after seeking the information or not seeking. So what I'm wondering, what actually happened to those people who were they released, were they killed, or like did people go to court? And is there any information on the number of people who were captured or are still under custody?
So we don't know all of those answers. What we do know is that based on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Torture Report Executive Summary, the CIA subjected over 100 people to torture. We don't know how many people the CIA may have sent to surrogates to interrogate. We have 40 prisoners at Guantanamo Bay currently. 10 are in some type of judicial process that we call military commissions. 30 sit there in limbo. 30 people sit in U.S. custody, a country that was founded upon human rights, right? A country that claims that there are inalienable rights that a human being has. We have 30 people sitting in indefinite detention without trial at Guantanamo Bay right now, while we have 10 going through some type of judicial process we call military commissions. And so we don't know all of those answers. As I said, when they first told me about the torture program and told me it was all secret, no one would ever know, my response was, there are no secrets, only delayed disclosures. So at some time, at some point, we will know more and more about this. The judicial process called military commissions at Guantanamo Bay continue to yield more and more information that has been declassified. We now know through that judicial process that FBI personnel were actually at black sites, something before that was highly classified information. And so there's hearings, I believe, going on today for the Cole suspects. I know there were yesterday because I was monitoring tweets of a New York Times reporter, Carl Rosenberg, on Twitter about what was happening down there. FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, continues to yield more information. The ACLU has taken Mitchell and Jessen, these two voodoo scientists, to a civil court in Seattle. In January, Mitchell and Jessen, the same two voodoo scientists who had no experience, who made $80 million in a torture program, will be on the stand at Guantanamo Bay being subject to questioning by defense counsel for some of those being held at Guantanamo Bay. And so history is folding out before our eyes. Now, it's hard for us to see because of everything else that's swirling in this post-truth era that goes on. But we will know more and more each and every day. I will probably go home tonight and learn some other detail that's been disclosed on Guantanamo that I didn't know I was able to talk about because it's now declassified.
All right, so I think we have time for a couple more questions. Anybody? Yes?
So my question would be, we all know that torture is bad. We all share that opinion. Even Obama didn't manage to shut down Guantanamo Bay, though. So why is it so hard to convince American politics, especially, that it is bad and that we need to put an end to it?
Yeah, the problem, when Obama took office, he issued Executive Order 13491 that said we won't torture. And he created actually a research program, and he created established what was called a high-value detainee interrogation group. And they had a research program, and I was actually the chair of that research committee. So there's been a lot of effort to understand now, okay, we're not going to torture, but then what do we do? How do we ensure that the techniques that we're using, the methodologies we're using, are informed by science? So we are getting accurate, reliable information. So that's good. That's a great thing. However, what he did that was horrible, in my opinion, was he said we need to look forward, not backwards. That policy of impunity for torture has led, in my opinion, to the resurgence of torture as a possible option. The Donald Trump's ability to speak out about that. Right now, the director of the CIA is a woman named Gina Haspel, who by her own congressional testimony had some deep connection to the torture program and was somehow involved in the process for the destruction of videotapes that would have been videotaped evidence of the atrocities that were being committed. And so while you still have people within the government who are connected with this program, it's going to be hard for the U.S. to reconcile with that because it would implicate people who are currently in high-level positions of power.
Unfortunately, this is all the time we have today because there's class right in this room. So sadly, we have to interrupt the conversation, but thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking here Mark Fallon.